Hello and welcome to the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Yes, I am an actual magician, and today we're going to be taking a look at my top 10 Lenormand cards, or Lenormand decks. Now, I've already done a history, which I'll put up here, and gone through each of these cards one at a time, giving the traditional, so-called traditional meanings of the cards. But today I'm just going to quickly look at our top 10 Lenormand decks as part of my top 100 tarot and oracle decks sequence. This is going to be tacked on as an extra video. And I'd like to start with some historical decks. Now, when Tali and I first decided to repopularize the Lenormand and start the Cards of Antiquity campaign, it was basically, as I think I've explained in one of the other videos, so that we could have a rose key in a deck. We were looking for this unique symbol that we wanted as a token of our Cartier to weave throughout a tarot cinematic universe, and we chose a rose key, and then went looking for decks, and we found this little known Lenormand deck that had both a key and a rose on the bouquet card on it. And we did some research, wanted to publish a book on it. We were told that there wasn't enough interest, so we decided to publicise the Lenormand in our Cards of Antiquity campaign, and the rest, as they say, is literal history. And these are historical decks. These are from the early 1900s. It's the Dondorf deck. We can tell that from the BD on the back, and you can see that these cards are very worn. They've been used a lot. Say they're late 1800s, early 1900s, perhaps around 1910. Strangely enough, the same time that the tarot was about to be repopularized in 1909, 1910, with the publication of the Waite-Smith tarot. This deck was already in popular use at that time. There's the rider. You'll notice that there are no card inserts, and this is specifically a Lenormand deck taken from the Game of Hope, and we can see here that it has the German inserts, little rhymes giving the meanings of each card and their use in divination and fortune telling. This was also published by Gibson, and here is an example, again in French. Lenormand, a Parisian diviner. You can see that Gibson were also following the German original publication of the deck as an authentic deck used by Mademoiselle Lenormand, when of course it certainly wasn't. Was the Game of Hope, published after her death, and we can see this has a little insert from the box, and then has the Gibson printing. Now it's got a border around it. It's obviously a more modern printing, like the fox has a bird. There is the little booklet goes with it, again popularising the idea that Lenormand herself used these. And this again takes from the Philippe sheet, as it's known, one of the original meanings of each of the cards. But of course, you notice mountain, if close by, you may take it that you have a dangerous enemy. As I've explained in the first of the two videos going through each card one at a time, this is actually coming from the reading of Coffee Grounds, which in turn comes from the reading of dream symbolism. So a ship in a dream is a well-known symbol in dream symbolism, and then made its way into the reading of Coffee Grounds, and then made its way into the symbols of the Game of Hope, which then made it into the Lenormand deck itself, with the playing card inserts as well. I have yet to find any viable rhyme or reason for the allocation of the cards, whether they have like the German and French inserts on some of the older decks. Here we just have the standard playing card inserts in the Gibson deck. I can't find any good system allocation of the playing cards to the cards themselves. You look at the old cartomantic meanings, as we did in our book Tarot Time Traveller, then apply those to the symbols and meanings of the Lenormand cards, and it seems a little bit ad hoc. And of course it comes from the Game of Hope itself, so it's highly unlikely that J.K. Hector, who designed the Game of Hope, had any particular Kabbalistic or numerological or fortune-telling system in mind with that allocation, but I'd stand to be corrected if that's the case. So these, say, are some of the older decks that I just wanted to show you before we go into the top 10 itself. This is the Wurst deck from Frankfurt. Fortune-telling cards, Forsage Carton, I can never pronounce it, but Lenormand, and again the German meanings and the publisher's stamp on that card there. That would usually go on an ace card in a standard deck. I think that was for tax purposes. And again, we've got the same numbers from the Game of Hope and a very nice depiction of each of the cards there. Again, we've got the fox on the path. This would have been from the tales of Reynard the Fox, popular in Germany at the time. Similar with the bear and so forth. Dam, the woman, the letter, and so forth. And again, we can see this pseudo-mysticism, pseudo-occultism being applied to the cards with the Mademoiselle Lenormand looking mystical, almost Egyptian in style on the deck itself. Again, this is a very old deck, probably late 1800s. So we collected a load of the decks, obviously, before it became popularised. We knew that these would be in short demand once it became popular, although we weren't expecting it to become so popular. And then we have a standard print of the deck. You can see, again, the singular playing cards now replacing the verses, with the ring, the house, the moon, and so forth, all of the symbols that I've gone through in a previous video. And this particular deck has a proper Philippe sheet, as it's called, said to be written by a nephew of Mademoiselle Lenormand. This is in German, but again, it reproduces the first printing of that. Just hold this up. I have to be very careful with this. This is a bit of a museum piece. And we can see the Mademoiselle Lenormand in Paris. It's a famous fortune teller and so forth. It goes into her background, but again, it's not exactly true because these meanings were taken from the meanings of coffee ground readings, as we saw in the amusements of the Germans that we published in English, and was published in English to begin with. One of the oldest examples of the meanings given to these cards, which was actually in English, not in French, German, or any other language. So those are the historical cards that we are looking at. And so now I'm going to start my top 10. And unlike tarot and oracle cards, we're after simplicity with Lenormand cards. We're really after something that communicates the basic symbol to us. A tarot card is more of an emblematic device. It's more of a metaphor because it has a lot of symbols on it. The colours are symbols, the numbers are symbols, the shapes are symbols, the hand gestures are symbols, the faces are symbols, the symbols of the pillars, for example, the scroll, the moon symbol, everything else you might see on the High Priestess card are all symbols in themselves. The Lenormand cards are very different, and we read them differently. Each of them is a single symbol, meaning a fixed thing that then is stretched into a sentence in the reading method itself. So it's a single card made into a sentence. They are more like letters than words or phrases. So we build them up with more of the cards than less of the cards. We can do a one-card reading in tarot. That is possible in Lenormand, but not to be recommended. Perhaps it's far better to have more cards, even if you're only reading a few of them in the actual reading that you do. So let's have a look at our top 10 of Lenormand cards. So deck number 1, top 10, is our own reprinting of the Game of Hope, the Spiel der Hoffnung, with German and French. This is a recreation of the box that it came in, that is in the British Museum, that Tali and I went to view and then had reprinted, licensed by the British Museum itself. And this is what kick-started the whole Lenormand Renaissance, Revolution, Revival, whatever you might call it, popularity, virality. And so this is a reproduction of the original cards. Now, the original cards, when you go and see them, if you go and see them in the museum, are not in a tin, they're in a cardboard box, and they come with the Game of Hope instructions, and they are certainly not as tidy as this, and they are hand-coloured, probably by a child, I would imagine. I don't think a parent would have done this, because it was a parlour game. And we asked Shiro Marchetti to digitally tidy the cards that have rips, folds and bends in them, but still keep them as true as possible to their original design and artwork. So these are tidied up a little bit. You can perhaps see that there was a fold in this card that Shiro straightened out to neater edges. And we've left some of the markings on the cards, particularly the coffin card. You can always tell if it's from the British Museum version because of some of the stains and marks on the cards, like under the heart. So we can always tell an unlicensed copy has been made. And the staining that Shiro's extended to the edges sometimes. And again, we have the German and French cards. So we have the acorns here and the clubs here on each of the cards. And originally, when we first printed this deck, the first edition of this deck, and we're now on the 6th edition, and we still have copies of it available. I'll put a link down below. I think we literally have a handful of the 5th edition and a little bit more, maybe 2 handfuls of the 6th edition, but we only publish them as 100 in each edition when we license them from the British Museum. So if you're interested in a properly authentic deck, I have to be a bit self-serving, but I do think this is the best deck that is on the market because it's the one that is truest to the Game of Hope itself. It's we paid for very high quality images to be taken of the original cards, and then had Shiro Marchetti kindly work on them for us, which in turn sparked his interest in the Lenormand, which we'll take a look at in a short time. And I love the sun card here. So the first printing of these had a slightly greenish tint in the printing, and whilst some of our very vocal detractors at the time, who really hated us doing this for some obscure reason, tried to say that the printing wasn't very good and so forth. Actually, those greenies, as I now call them, a little bit like the first edition of the Thoth. They are slightly tinted, and they have their own unique quality to them, and now they are rare as hen's teeth. So hopefully the greenies will have a life of their own over time. You can see we have the flag of Nuremberg on the back of that ship, which identifies it back again to the Game of Hope. It was published in Nuremberg by J.K. Hechtel and then resold as the Lenormand. So this predates some of our very older decks. The Game of Hope is actually the predecessor to the Dondorf and all of the other historical decks. This is prehistorical in the sense of this is where they were all taking from the Game of Hope, and it comes in a dinky little tin with a reproduction of the original packaging on it, again from the British Museum. So that is deck number 1. This is the one I use all of the time for my own Lenormand readings, and it's the bare bones. It is the Game of Hope from which all Lenormand decks come. So deck number 2 in my list of top 10 Lenormand decks is by Shiro Marchetti, is the Gilded Reverie Tarot. This comes in a number of versions. Originally, when we worked with Shiro to redo the original Game of Hope, he then got interested in the cards and decided to design his own, so Tali advised him on that. And this is one of the very first test printings, and I think one of them has Tali Goodwin's name actually on it somewhere, but I think Tali's got hers kept somewhere safe, I would imagine, because this is one of the first test prints of that deck, the Gilded Reverie deck. And then once Shiro had published it, it's now published by, I believe it was US Games, and it was first published as so, and they didn't want to include some of the extra cards that we'd put in it, and was in the self-printed version of it, so they went with a straight 36, but then it was republished as an expanded edition. And this particular deck is one that I actually bought to showcase a illegal copy of the deck. It's one of the many decks that became pirated. So the expanded edition, in this particular case with the extra cards in it, is an illegal copy, which I just used to talk about, do another video about illegal copies of decks and so forth. So the Gilded Reverie itself and the expanded edition are both authentically published by US Games. And I like these because they are they were one of the first, in effect, mass market decks to be published. And so therefore, as a historical thing, it has interest in that. And you can see that this is a very Shiro Marchetti deck. It's vibrant, coloured. The design is clean on it. You can immediately see what's on each card: the moon, the birds, the mice. I love the playfulness of the mice. They are a little bit more destructive in meaning and negative than perhaps this little playful mouse here. The clouds with the light and the dark, which is a good carry forwards. The rider on the rainbow, again the idea of a messenger, but again we're starting to see the addition of extra symbology into the original meaning, which just needs a rider with a message. The storks, the house, a very instantly recognizable style by Shiro, the lilies and so forth. And again, I've talked in the meanings of the cards, the 2 videos that I've done for that, which I can link up here perhaps, as to why Tali did the research into the extra cards. We decided on a certain set of those, and Shiro published some of them, and then in the Cyberpunk Lenormand I published some of the others as well from our original research. And the original introduction is by Tali, who worked with Shiro to actually produce the designs and advise on the meanings of the cards for the deck itself. So that is my deck number 2, the Gilded Reverie Lenormand, and it comes with a wonderful reading cloth as well that I actually use in combination with my deck number 1, the original Lenormand, to do readings, because it helps with picking out the houses if you're doing a big grand tableau as well. So do get the reading cloth as well as the Gilded Reverie deck. It's a beautiful companion piece to the style of reading, and you can lay it out, and it's a beautiful thing when all of the cards are actually laid out as well. So that's deck number 2, the Gilded Reverie deck, if you're not going for the original Game of Hope that we've republished as our deck number 1. So deck number 3 is our very own Cyberpunk Lenormand, which comes in a nifty black bag. And there is a reason other than the self-serving nature for this being my 3rd favourite Lenormand, which is the one I've designed myself, which is the Cyberpunk Lenormand. And this is mainly because of the keywords. If I can get the keywords right here. Because in order to do this deck, what I actually did was went back to our little book under the pen name Andrea Green's 7-Day Lenormand. And this basically has, for all of the cards, a original verse form at the top, dream symbolism, coffee card meaning, coffee card verse from the actual cards themselves, the Game of Hope instructions for the card, what Waite said about that symbol when he was talking about the reading of coffee grounds, contemporary meanings from French, German and other sources, and a functional meaning and a simplified what you say. The heart is love. At the end of the day, the heart is love. If it's one word, then that's the key word for this card. That goes back to, it's a sign of joy leading to union and bliss. So basically, this book, even though it's written from a sort of popularist standpoint and it's very accessible, 7-Day Lenormand, it's got all of the core meanings in it, and I just wanted to put those into a deck. So I took all of the historical meanings. I wanted to see how far I could keep the actual meanings but stretch the design into the future, because I've always been interested to understand how tarot and Lenormand and divination and symbolism itself, the whole oracular sphere, might mutate over the next 1,000 to 2,000 years. So I wanted to start to test that out by taking a deck based on original meanings all the way back to our very earliest form of divination with dream meanings, and actually put that into a futuristic setting. So that's one of the extra cards where I actually went for a rose, a font, like a fountain, like the fountain card here, and then a card for the reader themselves so that you can actually put yourself into a reading, a general card for a sitter if they don't want to use any of the variations of man or woman, the ways, rather bedraggled mouse, futuristic heart, the ring with the infinity symbol buried into it, the books, the letter, and so forth. So basically this is a deck that I use also a lot if I'm not using the original Lenormand, the Game of Hope, because I like the aesthetic of the cyberpunk genre, and I also like the fact that having a dystopian future to some extent allows us to have negative cards in the deck itself and not shy away from having negative cards, because that allows you to do far more straightforward, powerful readings as well. And it also allowed me to fix some of the meanings into the cards that I actually use in readings based on the historical understanding of the cards themselves. So that's deck number 3, and that is the Cyberpunk Lenormand. We have quite a few of these remaining. I think we have quite a few of them, not too many, from our Kickstarter that was successful to publish these, and these are in print and in stock at the moment. So again, I'll put a link if you're interested in getting a Cyberpunk Lenormand deck. And we were also able in this, with the gate card here, to put in some of our Cartian symbolism as, again, part of our extended cartomantic universe that we have been busy building over the years. And we were also able to put a gate card in here with the roses around it to have a illustration that is part of our cartomantic universe that we've been building over the years, for example with our Arcartia project as well, going back to the roots of the symbolism, and in this case the invitation to initiation that is built within all of our work as well. So that is deck number 3, the Cyberpunk Lenormand. So deck number 4 is actually a range of decks called the Parrot Decks, Piatnik Decks, Owl Decks, and so forth, depending on the design that's on the back of them. Some of them have owls, some of them have birds, parrots, doves. And this is basically the deck I used to practice with when we were first starting this project. And this is made in Austria by Piatnik. And sometimes this is republished, even though it's a German style of deck, as the French cartomancy deck. You can tell which deck you're looking at by the symbol up there. And again, we see this deck has borders, it has the animals, it has a card insert, but not 2 cards insert, and no verse either. There's the child following the hoop, the cross, the clover, the tree, and so forth. So this style of deck was one of the more popular styles before the boom of deck designs, cartomancy deck designs, Lenormand deck designs in the last 10 years. In fact, more decks have been designed and produced in the last 10 years than in the last century for Lenormand. So that's really how we would define a boom. It's literally within the last 10 years since we repopularized it. But this has a place in my heart. It's the deck that I'm sort of more familiar with than any of the other decks, other than the Game of Hope deck itself, as to just, I use this to learn, practice with, do readings for people when people weren't quite sure what Lenormand was, and I was learning it from the original French and German books. And Charlie was doing the research into the history of it. And this was a deck that just accompanied that journey. So it's my deck number 4. And again, I guess you would call this a Piatnik deck. It's the publisher, the Piatnik deck, and there are different versions of it. And we can see a very different image of Mademoiselle Lenormand on that one. Just taking it into this century. And as I say, some of them are defined by the type of bird that's on the back of it. So that's deck number 4, the Piatnik deck, or the Blue Owl deck, depending on which version of the deck that you actually get. Deck number 5 is the Konigs Furt publication of the Lenormand. Again, sometimes this is reproduced, even though it's a German publisher, as the French cartomancy deck. and this is by Konigs Furt. And again, for the same reason as the Piatnik deck, this was one of the decks that was in production, even though there wasn't a big market for them. Certainly the market was larger in Europe, a few other countries as well, but it was hardly known in the English-speaking world. And again, we can see the same design there with the fox catching the bird, the single playing card inserts, the numbers on both sides for some reason. I guess that's if you're spreading them like sideways, whichever way it goes, you can see the number at the top. There are very little variations of design improvement to some extent. It's like if you're going to improve or change the Lenormand deck, you have to either add things because there's very little you can take away. So sometimes the improvement maybe is a bit redundant for the way you're using it. For example, if you made the playing card insert even bigger, if someone doesn't use those in their reading, isn't playing a game of PK with them, then that would be pointless as well. So there's very little in terms of the design you can actually do, which perhaps explains why I only have a top 10 of Lenormand decks, even though I've got over 100 Lenormand decks. I counted them while I was sorting through them, and there's only about 10 of them that I actually use with any regularity at all. And the rest I couldn't find much in terms of their design, their aesthetic to really grab me personally. I always go back to the more historical versions of them. So this version, the Konigs Furt version, comes with a very small, this is obviously in German, Philippe sheet type equivalent with a quick way of laying out all 36 cards and doing the reading, but most of the text is actually the meanings of the cards themselves. So good luck if you're going to try and do a reading from that. Again, I'd recommend our 7-day Lenormand book to go along with this type of deck, because then you're going to get a true to the history version of the actual teachings, and with some considerations of what people have said and written in French and German and English since that time, particularly over the last 10 years. We meshed a lot of that together in the 7-day Lenormand. So this is the Konigs Furt Lenormand deck, and that is my top 5 out of my top 10 Lenormand decks to use. And you can see I've used this quite a bit. It's difficult to get them in the box. You can tell how much I might have used a deck by how damaged the actual box has become from taking it in and out of the deck, I guess. So that's deck number 5, the Konigs Furt Lenormand. Now, deck number 6 is a wonderful bridge between old and new. This is the Golden Venetian Lenormand by Eugene Vinitsky, and this, you'll recognise his name from my top 100 tarot decks. His Venetian tarot deck is one of my top 100 within my top favourite decks, and the same with the Lenormand. So here it goes into position 6 of a top 10 if I was forced to actually put them into some sort of order. So it's a wonderful design, comes with a certificate of authenticity, because again, unfortunately, a lot of these cards have been pirated and so forth, and there's a nod to the history. And there is a wonderful book that comes with it by Elsa. And again, this really does have a sort of wonderful way of reading the cards. It has events, business, finances, relations, recommendations. So depending on what context you're reading the card in, there's an interpretation, a fuller interpretation of how you apply the original meaning of the card to each of these areas. So that's something that isn't in a lot of the other decks, and I love it for that. So let's take a look at the cards. There's a wonderful carnival mask sort of background here, and then just look at how these cards are so beautiful. So here we have the messenger again with his bag, but obviously the horse is replaced by a gondola, and the playing card inserts have been put at the top there. There are extra cards. I love the mask, as you'll have gathered from my previous discussions of my top 100 decks as a symbol. And again, there are interesting extra cards in this. Well, not necessarily extra cards, but the extra cards are interesting. I love the bear here, the lilies, and so forth. Again, some of the extra cards sort of complete the story of the carnival. These really beautiful cards. I love the lighting effects, use of space on them. But again, the more elaborate the decks become, the more you have to look at the card to necessarily get its symbolism. Obviously, we've got the clouds here. It's a Venetian deck, though, so it has to have a Venetian scene in it, as opposed to just having just the clouds, because the clouds could be anywhere. So once you thematically start to design a deck, it starts to perhaps obscure the symbolism. Although with things like the ship, the golden barge there with the lion symbolism, that's an easier one to tell. So how do you do the clover? You do it in the window. But again, it's a little bit more difficult the more thematically stylish you want to be. And again, there's a problem with perhaps having an extra card here, card 47, that has a bird on it and a mask on it, as to confusion perhaps with the other cards, the existing cards. So that's a limitation with the Lenormand system itself when you're going to design any sort of thematically or extended version. I had the same with the Cyberpunk. How do you do the clover in a far future setting? Well, I did it in a sort of agro farm with almost cloned versions, like GM modified, genetically modified rows of clover, but the main symbol was clover, so that you could immediately tell when you looked at it that it was clover. And this is a wonderfully designed deck. Again, beautiful book, really useful book, and wonderfully boxed as well. So this is deck number 6, the Golden Venetian Tarot. I haven't used this as much as the others because, as I say, with Lenormand, I tend to stick to the historical decks and Game of Hope deck and the Cyberpunk deck. Obviously, I have a vested interest in that one as a designer of it. And these decks I do use on occasion because they are just gorgeous decks to use and to read from, and also referring to the way they've interpreted the meanings of the cards really helps extend your own ability to read a particular style of deck. So that's why I'd recommend the Golden Venetian Lenormand as deck number 6. So deck number 7 in my top 10 is a personal favourite. It's the Lenormand Revolution by Ross Foster and Carrie Paris. Carrie, we've met several times. wonderful person, and her deck really celebrates the whole revolutionary nature of the Lenormand itself at the time. And I've got two versions of this, one of the very first printings of it, and then the boxed version as well. And this basically takes the French Revolution as its thematic starting point, and then it also has some extra cards, and it has a wonderfully, if I can get that in focus, it does have variations of the cards, for example, the Inventor and the Gentleman for 28, the Seer and the Lady for 29, so it does have some interesting design changes in it. And the artwork, the montage artwork, is gorgeous. The stars, obviously we have the French Revolution theme, the letter, but this is such a stylish deck. And it was one of the first to come out during the immediate aftermath of the announcement that we'd made for the Cards of Antiquity campaign, where people went away and designed their own Lenormand decks quite quickly. Love the rose cross here. Gary was familiar with the rose cross and the rose key symbolism, so to some extent there's a nod to that. The anchor. But again, these are beautifully designed because they are really straightforward. You can immediately tell the sun, the sun, the sun, everything. The bouquet, the bouquet, the bouquet. It's really clear for reading, which I do like in a deck. The Inventor is a picture of Hector, J.K. Hector, the brass foundry owner, manager, son of a brass factory owner family who designed the Game of Hope, and to who the Lenormand cards are indebted because they are the Game of Hope. The Scythe, the Gentleman, the Lady, and so forth. So this really does, it not only, I like this not only because it carries the style and authenticity of the theme to which it's beholden to, the French Revolution, but also because it's really clear to read, so it's functional as well. And that's what I really like in a deck, that it's aesthetically pleasing and that the aesthetics actually support the functionality of the deck as a reading deck, as well as just being stylish. So the Lenormand Revolution, deck 7 out of my top 10 Lenormand decks by Carrie Paris and Ross Foster. Now, deck number 8 is a bit of a curiosity. It is the Mystical Lenormand, sometimes called the Troche Lenormand because it was painted by Urban Troche, and Victor, regular Elizabeth Victor, did the design, I guess, and wrote the book for it. Pamphlet for it. This is a A.G. Mueller deck, and I like this deck because it's been around quite a while and it sort of went under everyone's radar for a long time, and I think it was one of the first attempts to really repopularize the deck itself, perhaps in a wider market in America, in the UK, outside of Europe. And so this one I love for doing that. The main issue with this particular deck is, again, the design. So it has a very accessible booklet. I was just checking. It also, because this was before I researched, it really didn't pick up on the fact that it was the Game of Hope. So it does assign it to Lenormand herself. It goes back to the famous fortune-telling cards by Mademoiselle Lenormand, and then it has a bit about Lenormand. And our research is actually the main bit of the research for connecting it to Hector, J.K. Hector in the Game of Hope, was actually done by Professor Hoffman, the late Professor Hoffman, and he was the person who actually pointed out that the so-called Mademoiselle Lenormand deck went back to the Game of Hope. that was done in a German publication, was buried, became a little footnote in Decaduma and De Paulus's book, and it was that footnote that Tolly and I took our inspiration when we were researching the deck itself. And now it's fairly common knowledge, I hope, that this deck goes back to the Game of Hope and not Mademoiselle Lenormand. But it just shows how proper, good, authentic research can get buried in another language, then can get buried in a footnote of books that are now out of print. A lot of Decaduma and De Paulus's work is sadly out of print, and that's where a lot of the proper history of the cards, tarot cards, comes from. So this deck is a bit of an outlier to some extent in that it's trying to popularise the deck before it became popular. And the design of it I love because it's of its time. I just love the design, you can tell. But you'll notice it doesn't have the playing card inserts. It has the numbers. I like the fact that the birds are owls. Tree. The key. And so forth. But the symbolism is slightly wonky on it, I'd say. It's not as clear as it could be. Obviously, some of them, the ship, the bouquet, and so forth, the child. But some people just don't vibe with the artwork itself for this deck. And so it's become a bit of an outlier, but it's one that I keep in my reading pile because I love using it, and I don't want it to be forgotten because it was around for quite a long time, just valiantly trying to popularise the Lenormand to a wider audience before it really took off, before, as a friend of mine said, quoting, who was it that said, when it's steam engine time, everyone's steam engines. I think it was someone odd, I can't remember. I'll see if I can remember who put the quote and put it down there. But it just wasn't Lenormand's time when this deck first came out, but it was still there. It was valiantly fighting its own little corner in the world, trying to get some traction. It wasn't until a while later that it actually, the Lenormand found traction, and decks like this may have been a bit forgotten, so I like to keep it within my reading pile so that I'm often reminded of it and do use it on occasion. It's a nice little deck for self-readings. That's really, I don't think I've ever read for somebody with this deck, but I've read for myself with it. So that's deck number 8, which is the AGM Urban Trosh deck, painted by Urban Trosh, the Mystical Lenormand. I love this deck. And in deck number 9, you'll see my quest for simplicity in a Lenormand deck. I've used this quite a lot. It's Lenormand Arlo. And I don't know if it's in publication, whether there are any particular versions of this deck. It was a limited print. I think it was 150. This is number 31. It was published in 2009, which was comparatively middling in the Lenormand Renaissance, but now seems an awfully long time ago. And you'll see why I love this particular deck. It's on very plain card, just very plain card. And the reason I love the deck is because of its simplicity. I use this quite a bit. Mice, stork, anchor, fox, sun, scythe, ways, tree. You can, lilies, bouquet. So you can see immediately what the darned card is. There's nothing else on the card to distract you from the garden. You can immediately see what the symbol is on each card. And that's what I love about this deck. And when you lay it out, it reads blisteringly. It just reads straight away. It's so clear once you've got the meanings in your head for the cards and you stick to them. For example, using 7-Day Lenormand, Andrea Green book that I mentioned a couple of times, and then apply those readings and really stick to those readings and not try and do something clever with it. This deck reads like an absolute charm. And that's why I like it, because it is a proper Lenormand deck. Functionally, it just functions purely as a Lenormand deck, and you'll see that my deck number 10 has very similar qualities to it. So whilst I do enjoy some of the aesthetics of some of the decks that we've looked at already and some of the others in our collection, it's the simplicity of a deck that really appeals to me with Lenormand. Not so much tarot, certainly not with oracle cards. With tarot, I love photographic decks. With oracle cards, I love thematic decks that have landscapes, journeys, maps, all of that sort of theme to them. And with Lenormand, I love the straightforward decks. And all of that comes from reading them, from actually using them for clients, for myself, over years and years and years. That's what I find works for me. So it's really important to find what works for you, hone that down. It wasn't for years and years and years I realised I liked photographic decks. My dad is a keen photographer. He really instilled photography and the ideas of photography into me, even though I'm not a very good photographer at all. But it took me a long time to really realise that, and then to leverage that by looking for good photographic decks and using them. So it's really important to think with Lenormand, what are you drawn to? What reads well for you? What do clients rave about when you use it? And then sort of hone down, what is it about decks that I like, that I find I can get to work, that speak to me and my clients in some way. Do it for Lenormand, do it for oracle decks, do it for tarot decks, and you'll save an awful lot of time in really charting your own cartomantic odyssey, your oracular odyssey through tarot, through cartomancy, through Lenormand, through oracle decks as well. So that is my deck number 9, Lenormand Arlo. Limited edition, but if you can find a copy or find something that is as beautifully simple as this deck, and again historically accurate with the child playing with the hoop as we've seen on some of the historical decks, then go for it. So that's deck number 9, Lenormand Arlo. And then finally, deck number 10 in our top 10 Lenormands is the Victorian Lenormand. I don't know much about this deck, about the designer, but this deck is one that I have used a fair amount. It's starting to bend with a bit of age now. The victorianlenormand.info is the place to go. I'll check if the site's still available. But the reason I like this deck, and I wanted to round off and return back to our cartomantic roots with this deck in our top 10, talking about Lenormand, is, again, the design of this has done something slightly different that has actually added to its utility and not masked it, disguised it, or conflated it and lost it in some way or another. And what the Victorian Lenormand has done is put the card insert around the edge as if it was a playing card, and then put the Lenormand card without any border, the image in the middle of it. So it's really clear what you're looking at, but also for people who want to use the playing card cartomancy readings, as we've looked at again in our book Tarot Time Traveller, we looked at the history of cartomancy and how the meanings became applied to playing cards in the first instance, and then how that's developed over time. You can actually use this deck for that. So it's a nice bridging deck, in the same way that the Marseille Cats Tarot is a good bridging deck between pure Marseille decks and tarot decks, or back from tarot decks to Marseille decks. this functions as a bridge between Lenormand back to playing card decks, or if you're familiar with playing card deck readings, into Lenormand. Although again, the correspondence of the playing cards to the Lenormand is a bit suspect. I've never been able to find a systematic explanation of why Hector did it the way that he did it. It's interesting that the birds is slightly bordered, whereas the moon and all of the other cards, as far as I recall, don't have that border on. I suppose it depends where they took the original stock art for this. I would guess that it's stock art and not hand-drawn. But I love this because of the design change to it that actually adds to the utility. We now have playing card utility within the deck that doesn't then completely override the meanings of the deck itself. And again, I've used this with clients, I've used this for demonstration readings because it looks pretty cool to have what in effect appear to be playing cards out in a grand tableau, a 36 card grand tableau, and still be able to read them straight from the Lenormand card meaning itself. But again, it could be very confusing for people who do plain playing card readings, because these cards have very specific meanings depending on which source you've used for your meanings, or how you've learned them, who you've learned them from, and so forth. And that might not always gel or vibe with the main meanings of the card itself. Again, perhaps doing this top 10 list has reminded me that I need to go back and look at that, because I did try playing around with it an awful lot, looked at all of the different playing card systems, cartomancy readings, all sorts of ways of arranging playing cards in game form as well as cartomantic form, and I couldn't find a system that fit conclusively, consistently, comprehensively through the Lenormand cards themselves. But we end with the key, I guess, which is a good card to end with. So this is the Victorian Lenormand. I'll show you that. And if the website's still available, I'll link it down below. And that is my deck number 10. So I hope you've enjoyed this little brief run through the top 10 Lenormand cards. Say I've done 2 other videos going through all of the real meanings, I guess, the traditional, authentic, schmooshed readings for each card in 2 separate videos. And I've done another video on the history of the Lenormand, an introduction to it, and so forth. So thank you for watching this video and going through the top 10 and of Lenormand cards and the history of the cards a little bit as well as we've done so. And I look forward to seeing you in a future video. And until then, as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.